And it is a position that comes to us so naturally. It's so easy for us to assume a mentalizing stance, not just to one another, but to, animals, infants, computers. We just find this idea that we can explain and predict the behavior of others through appeal to mental states just incredibly natural. And so if we really did have to get rid of it, I think it would be difficult to maintain a lot of the things that we care about. And so taking seriously these challenges really matters, and trying to defend the position that I want to defend, I think really matters.
So welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Emma Borg. She is professor at the Institute of Philosophy School of Advanced Studies at the University of London, although before that, she was for a long time professor at the University of Reading. Her work focuses on the philosophy of language, mind, and cognitive science, and her books include Minimal Semantics, Pursuing Meaning, Acting for Reasons in Defense of Common Sense Psychology, and with Sarah Fisher, Meaning, a Very Short Introduction. And she has a variety of other articles and publications on these and related topics. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Borg.
Oh, thanks very much, Troy. I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to chatting. And I think you got all of my main points there, so thanks.
Yeah, so today's interview is going to be focused on your recent book, Acting for Reasons in Defense of Common Sense Psychology. And to start, do you mind just giving a brief overview of what is common sense psychology here, at least as it relates to reasons, at least roughly as a kind of introduction? What are we discussing here?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So as you say, the book is attempting to defend common sense psychology. And, in some ways in philosophy, the idea that it needs defense is slightly surprising because it's a kind of orthodox view in philosophy, but I'm sure we'll get on to talking about why we might think there's a problem with it. But it's an orthodox view. It's got an incredibly long history. It goes right back to at least to Aristotle and probably further back than that. And at its heart, I think it's just the idea that typically, broadly speaking, what we do for the reasons that we have. We're broadly speaking rational creatures who act on the basis of our reasons and respond to them in a rational kind of way. So that's generally the idea. I want to defend this idea that, we're doing what we do because of the reasons we have to do the things we do. I reach for the cookie jar because I think there's a cookie in there and I want a cookie. And that's this kind of mentalizing explanation of my actions. It's caused by my mental states. And that's kind of what I take reasons to be. As I'm sure there's a huge philosophical literature on what a reason is, but I'm just assuming that the reasons are the things in your head that you're acting on, these kinds of mental states that run all the way up to kind of propositional attitudes like beliefs and desires, may well involve other kinds of mental states as well, but kind of paradigmatically involve these belief and desire states. Now, I think if we're going to defend that common sense view, we actually have to get a little bit clearer on exactly what the account says. So if you want, I might go on and say a little bit more about it, but, is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, and then if you want, you can add a bit more about that, what the account says, and about individual rationality and
great.
what it predicts and so on. If you want, and then we can maybe get into some of the worries and then,
Yeah, perfect. So I think, that's what the account wants to say in kind of broad brush. It wants to say that we're reasons-based creatures who are doing what we do for the reasons we have. But to try and defend the view, I try and set it out a little bit more clearly in the book. So first of all, I think we need to note that there's kind of two important elements to the common sense model. So first of all, there's the idea that what we do is caused by our mental states. So, acting on a reason is in part doing something that's caused by the mental states that I have. And the reason we need causation in there goes all the way back to kind of Davidson, or certainly before Davidson, but he was the first person to really kind of codify it in his causal theory of action. And he pointed out that you can have a reason to do an action, you can do the action that reason supports, but that reason may not be the reason for which you did the action. So we've got this famous example of Oedipus. Oedipus wants to kill his father. He's riding off to go and kill his father, comes across a man in the street and for some reason kills the man in the street, and then goes on to try and kill his father. But unbeknownst to Oedipus, of course, the man he's just killed is actually his father. So Oedipus had a reason to kill his father. He killed his father. but intuitively he didn't do it because of that reason, right? He just, wanted to get the old man out of the way or something. So part of the common sense psychology model is this causal kind of picture, and then part of it is this, it's got to be more than just causation, right? It's got to be the right kind of causal relation. It's got to be the right kind of reasons-based relationship. And that's what gets us into this question of individual rationality in my book. So sometimes when people discuss common sense psychology, it's the idea of rationality isn't quite so much to the fore as it is in my book, I think. But I take it as absolutely essential to the view that we are, broadly speaking, rational, because what makes it possible for common sense psychology to even get going is the idea that there is a kind of set of responses that are appropriate given a set of beliefs and desires or given a set of mental states. So, it assumes that in the typical scenario, if you want a cookie and you think there are cookies in the jar, you're going to try and open the jar. That's just what it is to be a kind of rational creature, and that's the assumption that this belief desire framework is working on. So I think we need to recognize those two features, the causation and the rationalizing kind of features. And then the second distinction I think we need to make, or that I like to draw, is between the kind of two directions that common sense psychology can face in. So on the one hand, I think common sense psychology is a theory of what an individual does, and on the other hand, it's a theory of how we understand what a different individual is doing. So on the one hand, it's this kind of causal theory of action, the idea that we do what we do for the reasons that we have. And on the other hand, it's the idea that we can use that belief desire framework to understand the actions of others. And traditionally, or commonly in philosophy, it's actually that sort of third personal version of common sense psychology that's most to the fore. But one of the things I'm pushing for in the book is the idea that we really need to think of the theory as doing both of those things, as explaining why I did what I did and how I can understand why you did what you did. So looking in both directions.
Great. Yeah, and I think just like on the face of it, there should be something very intuitive about this. Like, of course, I went for the cookies because I like cookies and I saw the cookies there, Clearly that sort of explanation is a decent explanation of like what just happened there. Obviously, there's more that's going on and we can explain it in other ways, but I don't know. There's a sense in which the common sense psychology, at least as roughly laid out, is like just like intuitively correct. I mean,
yeah.
Nevertheless, as you get in the book, there are challenges, and
yeah, I think that's right. So I think it's an incredibly attractive kind of position, I think, and that's why it feels like often you don't have to defend it because it just seems so intuitive. And one of the things I try and do in the book at the start is to try and motivate the view just to make sure that people do appreciate what an incredibly powerful and successful kind of approach it is. It's kind of one of the things I really love about philosophy, right, is it takes things that just seem absolutely obvious and totally kind of unexciting and unmysterious and says, wow, look at that. How does that work? That's incredible. And so I think our ability to understand what somebody else is doing and to function in our kind of rich social world in the way that we do is really impressive. And common sense psychology gives us a really clear and easy explanation of how that happens. We view other people through the lens of mental states, and that makes what they're doing explicable, and it explains why I'm doing what I do for them. So it's this, that view hasn't always been held in philosophy, right? If you read the Churchlands, they will tell you it's not such a successful theory. They think that actually it's plagued by all sorts of kinds of failures. But I think actually, once we get away from the difficult cases, if we just think about the kind of quotidian, ordinary uses of common sense psychology in our day-to-day life, it's incredibly successful. It allows us to operate with ease in these complex kinds of situations. And if we try to imagine what it would be like to wake up in the morning and get through your day and get the things done that you get done, where you had no idea what the mental states of another person might be, I think it would be a pretty strange and terrifying kind of world, and it's very unlikely that we'd be able to do what we do. So And also there's this point about, you said it's incredibly natural. It's absolutely right. Victoria McGeer has this nice phrase that she uses. She says, we're inveterate mentalizers. We just can't seem to help ourselves. We just want to see the world through this kind of mental states lens. And I think that's exactly right. But the reason we're inveterate mentalizers, I think, reflects the unbelievable success of this theory. It's the fact that it just does work incredibly well when we're trying to predict the actions of other people. So in the book, I have a quote from Jerry Fodor that I like very much, where he's talking about the role that common sense psychology plays in our lives. And he says, look, the phone goes in my office. I pick up the phone. A voice says, do you want to lecture here in Texas next week? And I say, yes, absolutely. I'll be there on the 3:30 flight on Thursday. And he says, that's all that happens. But yet that tiny bit of evidence is enough to make it the case that 7 days later, or 7 weeks later, or even 7 years later, depending on how you set up the case, Jerry will be at the airport and the person who's invited will be there to pick him up. And if that doesn't happen, it's more likely that something's gone wrong with the airlines or the traffic than that something's gone wrong with our common sense psychology system. And that's an amazing thing. It's an amazingly successful predictive system. So I'm trying to argue that we need to recognize just how powerful it is and to hang on to it if we can.
Yeah, for sure. And as we get into some of the challenges here, because of course there are challenges, otherwise there almost wouldn't be a need for a sort of defense here, as you say. Mm-hmm. As we get into some of the challenges, it's probably worth citing some of the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who they're well known for some of their contributions in this field, like with the dual process theory stuff and the heuristics and biases program. And could you talk a bit about the influence of their work here and how it's shaped a lot of the discussion in this book and the challenges to common sense psychology? Yeah,
definitely. So, the first 2/3 of the book probably are hugely influenced by Kahneman and Tversky's work. And I should say, a lot of the book is about objecting to them, but I do think they've done a great job, right? I think Kahneman has done a fantastic job in getting us to think more about thinking and in getting the public to engage with questions of how we think and how we make decisions. So, although I don't think they're right, I do think they're great. So it's right, so we've got this incredibly attractive theory. It seems very intuitively compelling. It seems incredibly successful. I think a lot of philosophers just think that's fine. There's no problem here. When I first started writing the book, actually, I wrote up a version of one of the chapters and submitted it to a journal. And the comments I got back were, this argument seems pretty compelling, but why do we need it? No one would ever think that common sense psychology wasn't right. And that is surprising, because if you look in psychology, so a lot of the work I do is kind of interdisciplinary, a lot of it is at the border of philosophy and psychology. And if you look in psychology, it's much more common to think that we're not reasons-driven creatures, that actually most of what we do is driven by these low-level heuristics, implicit biases that sort of make us swayed this way and that by features of our environment, and that we're not considering reasons, or we're not considering reasons properly in the way that would be required for rational thinking. So, Kahneman and Tversky have these fantastic examples. I'm sure they're very familiar to most of your listeners, but maybe if we just run through one just to think about it. So I'll give you a couple. So I'll give you a kind of original Kahneman and Tversky one, which is the Linda case. So people may be familiar with this already. But in the experiment, people are given a little vignette about Linda. So you're told that Linda is a major in philosophy. She was a major in philosophy at university. She was very active in the anti-nuclear armament movement. She was an activist on campus. Tells you all these, all these other things about Linda. And then you're asked to judge which of these two claims is more likely or more probable. Is it more probable that A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, Linda is a bank teller and a feminist? And what you find is that people are much more inclined to say B, much more likely that Linda is a bank teller and a feminist. But of course, what Kahneman points out is that can't be the logical answer, right? Because we know from logic that a conjunction of claims, A and B, can never be more likely than one of those conjuncts on its own. So it can never be more likely that, I studied epistemology and ethics at college than that I studied epistemology alone. When you get a conjunction, it introduces more chance of getting things wrong, so it can't be more likely to be right than one of the conjuncts. So Kahneman and Tversky were interested about what was going on in that kind of case. Why is it that people aren't being logical? Why are they giving you this kind of non-logical, intuitive kind of answer? And they said that's because in that kind of situation, what people are doing is allowing themselves to be driven by the kind of stereotype that they have of a feminist. You tell me all these things about Linda, and that calls to mind this stereotype that I have, and she seems to fit the stereotype so well that becomes more probable to me. It comes to seem more probable than the claim that she's a bank teller alone. So the suggestion that these kinds of examples are supposed to give rise to is this idea that we have this kind of intuitive, gut feel, kind of habit-like response that we give. That's a kind of quick and easy route to decision-making. And the claim is that we use that kind of decision-making, these kinds of stereotype-driven, associative processes most of the time. And then we only wheel in the kind of slow, difficult, logical processing associated with kind of deductive logic or with probability theory. We only do that kind of thing if we come to recognize that something's gone wrong with our intuitive, heuristic-driven process. Or just to give you another really quick example, so this is not from Kahneman, this is from people who've kind of operationalized that heuristics and biases framework. So there's a big movement called nudge, which is trying to make us behave in certain kinds of ways, make better decisions. And the thought is you could make the public make better decisions, not by informing them about stuff, not by presenting them with arguments, but just by manipulating the kind of choice architecture that they find themselves in. So a kind of classic example of this is, imagine we want to make our public eat more healthily. Turns out in experiments that if you put someone in an environment where they can buy a snack, if you present them with a display where there are chocolates at eye level, people are more likely to buy chocolates. So there's chocolates at eye level and fruit at the bottom level. In that situation, people are more likely to buy chocolate. If you switch those two things around, people become more likely to buy fruit and less likely to buy chocolate. And then I think what people haven't noticed so much in philosophy is that if that kind of experimental work is right, if it's right that in Linda we're doing something kind of non-rational, and it's right that in this nudge case we're acting in a way that's not driven by what we believe and desire, because presumably our beliefs and desires remain constant across just that switching of the two elements in our environment. If that's right, if that experimental work is really right, it looks as if that common sense psychology model just can't be correct, because common sense psychology tells us that for the most part, what we do in response to our reasons. But I didn't tell you Linda was a bank teller and a feminist because I reasoned my way to that conclusion. I just had this kind of gut feel, this stereotype-driven, habitual kind of response. So that's not reason-driven. When I picked the chocolate over the apple in the nudge situation, or the other way round, that's not driven by reflection on my reasons, the thought is, because reasons remain the same across both situations. Instead, I'm just being driven by these kind of environmental manipulations. So in the book, I look at quite a lot of this experimental work, but the general take-home message of all of it is supposed to be, we're not properly reasons-driven. We're really what Killstrom has called kind of the people are stupid school of psychology. We don't know what we're doing. We're driven by habit. We're driven by bias. Most of the time, we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what we want. And we don't even realize quite how stupid we are, according to this sort of empirically driven picture.
Right. And then, so you characterize the two main challenges as the no reasons challenge and the insufficient reasons challenge, which I guess has sort of been getting at already, but we could maybe talk about them more explicitly. So if you want to start with the no reasons challenge and how, well, according to that challenge, we really don't act, or at least often don't act for reasons. So if you want to talk a bit more about that and
yeah, absolutely.
How that conflicts with college.
I hope that is a kind of contribution that I get to make to the debate here, because although I've been thinking about this kind of stuff for a really long time, one of the things I, still kind of have a bit of a problem with is trying to work out exactly what a heuristic is. So we use the term heuristics all over the place, but I think it's not obvious there's a kind of consistent understanding of what it is to be a heuristic throughout. And more crucially, I think it's not obvious what the exact argument against common sense psychology is supposed to be. So one of the kind of core distinctions in the book is what I call this distinction between a no reasons challenge versus an insufficient reasons challenge. So on the no reasons challenge, we're thinking of heuristics as these habit-like things where we think of habits as not consulting reasons at all. So they just bypass our reasoning system. It's what I call in the book a kind of directly stimulus-triggered action. So if you think again about buying the fruit in the nudge situation, it's not that I reason my way to it. It's not that my reasoning faculties get into the picture at all. I just see the apple in my eye line and I buy the apple, pick up the apple. There's just no reasoning going on. Our use of heuristics is diametrically opposed to our use of reasons. And you can see that understanding of what heuristics are embedded in the kind of broader framework that heuristics usually get talked about. So heuristics usually come hand in hand with what's known as the two-system or dual process approach to the mind. And on that kind of account, we have one system one, or one kind of process, type 1 processes, and those are the habit-based, easy, fast, intuitive, simple kinds of decision-making processes, that maybe the processes we use under conditions of uncertainty. So that's things like representation, stereotyping, availability, framing, all these kinds of types of decision-making process are supposed to be non-reasons based. So we get this big bucket of things that take place in system 1, and system 1 then is diametrically opposed to system 2, which is the home of reasoning. So system 2 is the system that follows rules, that looks at logic, that is slow and difficult and conscious and controlled, and all those things that we think, might go hand in hand with being a rational process. So on this way of thinking, where we've got these two systems, heuristic-driven and reasons-based, it becomes really clear that heuristics are supposed to be just non-reasoning. They're just directly stimulus-triggered. They're not looking to reasons at all. And I think that's a really important challenge, and it's probably, it's the most radical challenge that we can base on heuristics. But I think it's important to hold that apart from a second kind of challenge, which is this insufficient reasons challenge, which I think is actually the one that most advocates of heuristics maybe have in mind most of the time. So the no reasons challenge is the kind of, it's the more exciting of the two challenges in some ways, I think. But actually the insufficient reasons challenge is maybe the one most people have in mind. And it's this idea that heuristics are kind of rules of thumb. They are looking to reasons, they're just not looking to enough reasons. They're looking to maybe one reason or two reasons, or to a kind of a biased selection of reasons. We're not looking at enough evidence, and we're looking at a kind of self-selecting kind of evidence. So the thought here is that heuristics do still get you into the space of reasons. They are looking at reasons and there is reasoning going on, but they're doing so in a kind of way that's inappropriate and not sufficient for rationality. And I think holding those two objections apart really matters, because if you're someone like me who wants to defend the idea that we do what we do for the reasons we have, you're going to have different answers in mind depending on whether you're considering heuristics to be non-reasoning things or insufficient reasoning things. So I have these two different kinds of lines of argument.
Right. Good. Yeah. I mean, we might think that at least some of the times when we act, we're sort of doing it based on reasons, but there's also all this other stuff going on that influences how, what judgments we make and how we end up acting. And if we think that that plays a kind of dominant role, then even if we're partly acting based on reasons, it's not really enough for it to be like rational action or what we would normally expect under common sense psychology or something like that. And maybe that's one way to have insufficient reasons challenge. if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that might be right. So the insufficient reasons challenge looks to things like motivated reasoning, for instance. The idea that the kinds of evidence you will look at and the kinds of things you will take to be reasons is dictated, at least in part, by the things you already believe. So you come to the decision-making situation with a certain kind of mindset, and you use that to kind of select which bits of information you look at. And there's an argument that that's not what we would expect if you had this kind of common sense model in place, which thought of us as individually rational. I've got a kind of argument against that in the book, but I think you're right that there can be all these kinds of other things going on that help us make our decisions that aren't necessarily the reasons we would appeal to. But I think two things to say about that. One is I have a kind of similar line to a line that Neil Levy's taken recently, which is that we need to be aware of how wide the evidence base is in these kinds of cases. So sometimes some of the evidence that we're looking to is kind of meta evidence. So one of the kinds of cases we might think of that we get here, or one of the experimental bits of evidence, is something called the ballot order effect. So it turns out that your position on a ballot will very slightly influence the number of votes that you get. There's a little bit of a question about whether this replicates, but let's put that to one side. So, if you appear first on a ballot, you're going to get slightly more votes than if you appear third. And you might think, well, that's just absolutely irrational. How could that, the things that should matter about deciding who you're going to vote for should be about policies and maybe personalities, but certainly not position on a ballot. But as Levy points out, that kind of cardinal ranking, we're familiar with it from cases where it really does reflect something about the ordering of the candidates. We're used to lists of the top 10 where the first, the thing that appears at number one has sold the most copies or is thought to be the best, or, cardinal rankings that tell us which order we should carry out given actions in, if we're trying to fix our computer or something. So it wouldn't be surprising if when you come across a kind of cardinal ranking, you carry over a bit of that kind of idea that the ranking is going to be recommending something to you. So again, I think it's important to think about when this experimental work holds. So it might be right that when you've really got nothing to go on between these three candidates that you're trying to pick between, if one appears at the top and one appears at the bottom, you may well decide, or you may well just allow that kind of idea that one is being recommended to you to slightly dictate your choices. What would be irrational there would be if you really did know something about the candidates and yet you still allowed ballot order effect to take effect. But we don't really have evidence that that's the case. What we have is, that at the margins where you're not invested in a kind of ballot, you may allow that to take effect. So I think one thing to say is that, yeah, we do have this other stuff going on, but that may in itself count as some kind of evidence. And the other thing I think I want to say is one of the kind of main themes that I have in the book is we need to move away from the idea that what it is to be responsive to reasons is to be aware of the reasons you're responding to. So there's, a stance that's sometimes taken in philosophy, which is to be a reason is to be something that you act in light of. It's the thing that you can just directly point to and say, that's why I did what I did. That's the thing that was driving my behavior. But the model of common sense psychology that I think is feasible or plausible has to range wider than that, right? Because it has to allow that, purely kind of dispositional beliefs, things that haven't come to the forefront of consciousness, still can play a reason-giving role. So, if I'm making a cup of tea and I'm British, so I take milk in my tea, it may well be that once I've poured the hot water, I head to the fridge to get the milk out. Now, I may not be thinking about the state of the fridge. I may not be consciously considering whether or not there's milk in there. But my argument is that that's still a perfectly reasons-driven piece of behavior. I've got, there's a rational explanation for why I'm doing what I'm doing. And you can see that because it's open to control, right? So if I'm halfway across the kitchen and then you say to me, oh, by the way, I drank all the milk at lunchtime and there's none in there, I will change what I'm doing, right? I will stop trying to make tea. I will look elsewhere for milk, whatever. But that shows, I think, that, it really is rational. It really is reasons driven, even though you didn't have kind of conscious control at that stage. So one of the things I want to do is push on this idea that rationality requires kind of conscious access and conscious control.
Right. Yeah, and I did have something more about that. We'll come back to that issue in a bit, but just a sort of a side thing. Like when we start talking about reasons and whether like there's insufficient reasons, it sort of invites this question of like, well, where is there like sort of boundary there? Like, are there sort of minimal requirements for counting as acting in a reasons responsive way? Personally, I would say, this notion of rationality and reasons responsive isn't super precise. And so probably there's going to be a variety of cases which are kind of vague, but I don't know. Do you see what I'm getting at here? And is this a concern, or is it something we can more or less ignore for this analysis?
No, I think that's a really good question. And I think it's a great place to kind of try and put pressure on. And actually, my hunch is that there's going to be a lot of action in this kind of area. The book is about action, but no pun intended. There's going to be a lot of philosophical action on this topic, in the next few years, it seems to me. And I think in part that's because, well, for two reasons, right? So we're getting much better at trying to think through the kind of agency that non-adult humans might have. So the kind of agency that infants might have and the kind of agency that animals might have. And I think that's helping us to see that, agency may not be an all or nothing matter, and it may not be, acting on kind of full-blown belief, desire, propositional attitude states may not be the only notion of kind of agency that there is. And the second field in which I think this is going to become really pressing is thinking about artificial systems. So, the rise of the large language model has, raised lots of issues for philosophy. And one of the key kind of questions that these systems pose to us is, well, at what point do they become kind of agential? At what point do we think of them as acting for reasons and pursuing their own goals? And, I think more than the question of consciousness, that is going to be an interesting question. And I think what we're going to see, kind of as you suggested, is that there'll be a spectrum of cases here, and there may be features that we take it matter for counting as acting for reasons, which are instantiated in one case but not in another, or instantiated to a higher degree in one case and a lesser degree in the other. So I think I just want to agree with you. I think that there's definitely more work to do here in understanding exactly what it is to be acting for a reason. And I think maybe in my own defense, what I would say is that trying to defend common sense psychology in the book, I'm trying to defend the notion of being reasons driven, which is kind of paradigm in that literature. So it is this idea that you're driven by your mental states, that you're driven by that you have properly content sensitive processing going on, leading to action. The position that I really want to argue against is that kind of common sense psychology explanation only kicks in at the explicit case, only kicks in when we're really conscious of what we're doing. I'm less concerned by the idea that maybe there's a simpler system going on in animals or infants or in large language models. I don't really, I don't know what the answer is there. Maybe there is a simpler kind of system that these, kind of simpler systems are embedding or embodying. That seems to me less of an objection to common sense psychology than this idea that common sense psychology only occurs at the conscious level. So I would be happy with the idea that there are simpler ways and graded notions of kind of acting for reasons. And I definitely think it's something we need to explore more. But I think the view I was trying to defend in the book was this quite rich notion of what it is, and the question of whether or not that requires consciousness or not.
Right, fair enough. So yeah, there's still maybe room to develop those notions a bit more precisely, and maybe it would help think about other cases. But for the purposes here, we can employ this maybe more rich sense and concern ourselves with maybe certain classes of cases that are the standard ones without thinking more generally. I guess that makes the one way to put it anyway. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess one of the arguments that you consider in favor of the no reasons view, well, I guess you separate into two separate arguments, but it's the argument from the introspectable properties. And so as I understand it, the basic idea is that, like, well, if our decision making was arrived at, like our conclusions were arrived at through rational reasoning in accordance with common sense psychology, we would expect that, those features would be detectable by introspection, the sort of rational, like, reasoning, decision making. But in many cases, we're not able to introspect those. Rather, we introspect features like, that's like automatic or quick heuristics, or we realize that it's a matter of unconscious processing and so on. And so, given that's not what we expect in common sense psychology, it undermines common sense psychology. Is this a fair way to put this challenge, at least roughly? And if so, can you kind of expand on it and then maybe get into some of the issues you have with that line of reasoning?
Sure, I think so. So I think that's definitely kind of along the right lines. So one of when we look at the people who like heuristics and biases, when we look at the people who are real proponents of the kind of view, what you find is a really robust appeal to these kinds of qualitative, introspectable kinds of properties. So it's the idea that a decision came to you fast and felt easy and simple and had this kind of gut feel, intuitive, hunchy kind of nature to it, and that the processes by which it arrived were unconscious and you were unaware of them. And so I bundle all those kinds of properties together as kind of, broadly speaking, qualitative kinds of properties. And then I think one of the questions I really want to ask is, well, why would we think that bundle of qualitative properties is tracking this distinction between two different systems, right? So the idea is that when we set up our two systems of cognition, that bundle of properties of being fast, easy, gut-feely, unconscious, that's supposed to be indicative of a system one process, and something arriving kind of slow and difficult and consciously controlled, that's supposed to be indicative of a system two process. And in the book, I give us a couple of versions of how this argument is going to go. But on the most simple kind of version of it, it just says, we use these qualitative kinds of properties for holding apart these two different kinds of processes. And I just want to ask what the argument for that really is, right? Because if you think about lots and lots of kinds of uses of logical decision-making rules, they seem perfectly quick and easy and fast and kind of, intuitive. So if I tell you, John ate fish and drank lemonade, and then I ask you, did John drink lemonade? I imagine you'd find that pretty easy. As long as you thought I was asking you the question sensibly, you'd find it pretty easy to answer. And my suggestion is that from a kind of phenomenological perspective, it may well even seem easier than answering the Linda case, right? It's just a very simple, very easy bit of processing, but it's logic driven, right? That's a bit of conjunction reduction. And that's a rule from classical logic. That's not a heuristic. And so my thought is, at first, the first line of argument is, well, these qualitative profiles and kind of decision-making process just completely dissociate. Some uses of heuristics are actually slow and conscious and controlled, and lots are easy and unconscious and fast. But on the other hand, in logic, lots of cases of logic, lots of instances of logical reasoning are quick and easy and unconscious, and some are slow and difficult. Depends. So my thought is that those qualitative properties are really driven by things like how difficult the problem is, how familiar you are with the kind of problem, what kind of context you're in, how much time you've got to devote to things, how much kind of cognitive resources you've got going free, those are what drive the qualitative profile of a decision, not the kind of decision-making process. But if that claim is right, then it undermines this idea that, we've got these two different systems and that they're distinguished by these qualitative kind of profiles. Now, I think actually when you look at the literature, you find two different kinds of argument going on, appealing to these kind of phenomenological properties. So one is the one I've just given you, that, the idea that they just track different kinds of decision-making process. But there's also a kind of more robust way in which you could appeal to these kinds of properties, which would be to say, anytime a decision arrives fast or easy or unconsciously, then it just is heuristic driven, right? That's what it is to be a heuristic. It just tells you haven't gone through the reasons because it's got this kind of profile. And sometimes that is the argument you find in, Kahneman, for instance. So Kahneman says at one point, if someone asks you, what's 2 + 2, the answer 4 is just going to pop into your head. It's just going to shoot up there. And he says that's your automatic system in operation. You didn't have to reflect on it. You didn't have to kind of deliberate about it. It just popped into your head. And it's clear there that the argument he's got in mind is that qualitative profile is determinative of kind of processing, because asking about 2 + 2 = 4 is not a decision under uncertainty, which is where heuristics started, right? It's very certain what the answer to 2 + 2 is. And it's not a kind of classically heuristically driven process. It's driven by the laws of mathematics. But the thought is that because it's occurring fast, etc., it must be bypassing reason. It must be giving you this kind of shortcut. And then my response to that kind of argument is just to ask why you would think that holds, right? Why do you think that because something arrives quickly and easily, it must be circumventing reason? And that's kind of where this worry about consciousness comes up, because it seems that the most appealing line here is that, well, it's because consciousness is a prerequisite of something being a reason. If something is a reason, you must be able to it must be present in consciousness and you must be acting in light of it. And then that's the line that I'm trying to push back on when I'm thinking about consciousness as a cognitive state.
Right. So that seems pretty good. How would we think about rational action or reason-sensitive action in cases where it's entirely unconscious? Like for the people who might think, wait, that doesn't make any sense. That's not a, reason-sensitive mechanism. It's just some unconscious processing. Mm-hmm. How do you think, in what sense can it be reason-sensitive or rational in that sense?
Yeah, well, I think we need to look at the evidence about, can you bring it into consciousness? It may not be conscious when you're doing it, but can you, bring it into consciousness when you start reflecting on it? So this is the distinction between things which are kind of constitutively or necessarily unconscious versus things which just happen to be unconscious at the moment. I think it's very unlikely that we want to count things that are constitutively unconscious as reasons driven, but things which just happen not to be in consciousness at the moment might stand a much better chance. And then the argument I want to run is that you can see that these unconscious processes are appropriately sensitive to the content of other states, right? So that's kind of what it is to be reasons driven for me, is to be appropriately sensitive to the content of the states that are driving it or should be driving it. So actually, with another kind of hat on, I quite often think about pain. I do work on understanding of pain and the philosophy of pain. And there's lovely work there showing just how kind of sensitive or just how open to top-down effects your experience of pain is going to be. So people think of pain as the most kind of intuitive, bottom-up, grabby kind of mental state, but actually it's incredibly sensitive to the things that you believe and desire, to the kind of context that you're in, the kinds of contents that you're considering. So there's a nice set of experiments by someone at Oxford called Katja Weiss, and she runs these experiments where she hooks someone up to a drip, and the drip can either be delivering analgesic or not delivering analgesic, and then she puts a heat stimulus on their arm. And so there are 4 conditions, right? There's a condition where you're not receiving any analgesic and you're told you're not receiving any analgesic. There's a situation where you're receiving analgesic and you're told you're receiving analgesic. And then the two interesting situations are the ones where you're not receiving analgesic, but you're told you're receiving analgesic, and the situation where you are receiving analgesic and you're told that you're not receiving analgesic. So the situation where what you're told differs from what is actually the case. And what she found in these experiments is that responses about how much pain you're experiencing track not whether or not you're receiving analgesic, they track whether or not you've been told you're receiving analgesic. So in the situation where you're not receiving analgesic, but you're told you are, your pain will go down. In the situation where I lose track of which one is which, but in the situation where you are receiving analgesic, but you're told you're not receiving analgesic, it will go, I've lost my train of thought, it will go the other way, right? So the thought is that what that kind of experiment shows is that even these kinds of what look like absolutely unconscious processing leading to the experience of pain are highly sensitive to the things that you believe and desire. And I think that's an example of this idea that unconscious processing, at least sometimes, has to be considered to be properly reason sensitive. And in fact, that's a line, so lots of the heuristics and biases, people want to say heuristics are just like habits. And so they shouldn't be considered as thinking about reasons, because habits are just these blind, stimulus-driven responses. But actually, I'm very sympathetic to the view that might not even be right for classic habits, okay? Because even classic habits are highly sensitive to, kind of full-blown propositional information. If you're in the middle of a habitual bit of action and you get told that it's not this kind of context or there's some problem, you will be able to change what you do. Your behavior isn't just a kind of absolutely automatic, blind, unchangeable motor program that gets kicked in just because you bump into a bit of stimulus. It is still highly sensitive to the propositional contents that you have in your mind. So, I recognize that this is kind of a controversial point, that we have got genuine reasons-driven processing going on even at the unconscious level. But in my defense, all I need for this no reasons challenge not to go through is the idea that it's at least possible, right? And what you don't find amongst advocates of heuristics and biases is any argument to the effect that reasons have to be conscious, right? And I at least think that once we're sensitive to these kinds of points, the kind of weight of evidence gets pushed onto the heuristics and biases proponent to tell us why we should believe that reasons are only reasons when they're conscious. So at the very least, I like to think that I've pushed the argument slightly back onto their side to try and show us why we should believe that.
Yeah, good. I was thinking, one worry I was thinking about is that, suppose we think that, heuristics and otherwise quick processing and so on that results in judgments and action, that maybe that often aligns with what we have reasons to do. It sort of makes sense given our beliefs and desires and so on in that way. But nevertheless, it's not, strictly speaking, reason sensitive, because we're not actually acting on the basis of those reasons. So maybe it correlates. Our judgments and actions correlate with what we have reasons to do, but nevertheless, it's not reason sensitive in the sense that we're not actually sort of using those reasons to come to those decisions and actions. And someone might take this to think that, wait a minute, but in order for them to really be reason sensitive in that way, it kind of does require some actual reflective reasoning that's often not present. I don't know. Do you see this sort of challenge I'm getting at here? What do you think of this response?
I think so. Maybe I'm just going to want to dig my heels in at this point, though. So it's quite right that the sort of view I want to defend is, it takes a more kind of objective stance on what it is to be acting for a reason. So it's certainly right that the paradigm of a rational individual is someone who is consciously considering their reasons and is drawing a conclusion from them, probably using classical logic, maybe using probability reasoning, and is doing all of that work at the conscious level. But the sort of cognitive science framework I come from definitely thinks, that there is more going on in the mind than is just the stuff that appears at the level of consciousness. And if you have that kind of realism about the structure of the mind and the idea that the mind contains in some way representations of content, and that those contents can be manipulated by mental processing, the idea that that counts as genuinely reasons driven seems more reasonable, I think. And I think one way I would push back on the idea that consciousness is required would be to think about, well, what are we saying about consciousness here, right? So the idea that consciousness dictates whether something counts as reasons driven or not is really dependent on an assumption that the nature of consciousness is kind of binary. It's like a light switch, right? You shine your torch over here and that's conscious, and you turn your torch off and it's not conscious. But I'm not at all sure that that's really how we should be thinking about consciousness, right? I think it's much more likely that consciousness or attention is going to come in a graded kind of nature. Things are going to be more or less available to consciousness. And once we have that picture, it's clear that we can't base a kind of distinction between two different kinds of processing on the question of whether one is conscious or one is non-conscious, because we've got all this kind of, spectrum of cases where things are a little bit conscious and a little bit less conscious and a little bit less conscious, all the way down to absolutely unconscious. And it would seem just arbitrary to draw a line somewhere on that spectrum and say, well, these cases count as reason sensitive and these cases don't. There's the same, from this sort of realist picture of the mind, there's the same kind of processing going on across that spectrum. It's just that sometimes you're shining the light of consciousness onto it and sometimes you're not. So the picture I definitely prefer thinks of consciousness as floating over kind of cognitive process. So, heuristics can be used unconsciously, but they could definitely be used consciously as well. When I think to myself, when I'm trying to solve the Linda case, I might think to myself, God, I don't know, which should I say? Should I say she's more likely to be a bank teller? Should I say she's more likely to be a bank teller and a feminist? Oh, well, and this is one of the lines I have in the book, you've just spent a whole lot of time trying to tell me that Linda's got all these properties that fit with my stereotype of being a feminist. So, I'm going to decide that she's more likely to be a feminist as well as a bank teller because she fits my stereotype so well. If I do that kind of reflective thing, I've got a conscious process going on, but it's still a heuristic-driven process, right? It's still appealing to stereotypes. So again, the claim I want to make is just that these sorts of properties like consciousness, like speed, like ease, are just going to cross-cut the distinction we want to draw between heuristics versus reasoning. So, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of the maybe a lot of the disagreement here is just going to come down to, well, what sort of processes do or could count as reasoning or reasons based or reason sensitive. And I don't know, I could feel just people maybe just digging their heels in on different ways of thinking about that. Some more liberal and others more strict.
Yeah. So I think it's a kind of interesting feature of the debate that there's not a whole lot of discussion about this kind of core question, what it is to be reasons based. So the idea was just that we have this heuristics and biases, and they show us that we're kind of non-rational or irrational. Kahneman doesn't really like the idea that they show us to be irrational, but they show us at least to be non-rational. But obviously, to make that judgment, we need to know what it is to be rational, right? That's one of the things I want to say in the book. So it's odd that this debate takes place in a kind of vacuum, sealed off from these kind of fundamental questions about what it is to count as reasons driven. And so in the book, I'm trying to make that need clear. And I think what you're pointing to is absolutely right, that there's definitely more to say here. I don't think I've, given you the final word on what it is to be reasons driven. But I do think it's important to notice that we can't have this debate about whether heuristics show us to be irrational or non-rational without thinking about this fundamental question. And that's not what we find in the heuristics and biases literature. And then secondly, I do want to push for this more kind of liberal notion of what it is to count as reasons driven, pardon me, and rational, because so it's interesting that the Kahneman and Tversky literature appeals to this notion of association quite often. That's a key notion in heuristic processing, is that it's not reasons driven, it's purely associative. But I think that's leaning, or a question that raises is definitely, well, what do we mean by association? What kind of a mental process is that? Why would we think that association doesn't count as reasons driven? And I think there's definitely a debate to have there. I like to think of it as pretty much reasons driven. If you think of a neural network process, that's not your classic bit of computational reasoning or deductive classical logic where you've got little atomic bits you can kind of manipulate around the place. But you have got something that looks appropriately content sensitive, right? So if you think about a little neural network that's trained to recognize a dog, so every time it's given a stimuli, the judgment it's trying to make is dog or not dog, the way that system is going to arrive at an output is through a weighted consideration of features. It's going to get triggered by things like barking, having a waggy tail, having 4 legs. It's triggered by those kinds of properties. It weights those kinds of properties appropriately, and it allows that, distributed processing to run across the network and come up with a response. And one of the questions I have is, well, why wouldn't you think of that as reasons responsive, right? I can tell you why the system came out with the response that it did, because it was looking to these kinds of features and applying these kinds of weights. And that is, for me, as much reason sensitive as, working through a syllogism. I can't really see the difference.
Yeah. I guess if you sort of highlight the sort of almost a difference in degree rather than kind of these different kind of cognitive processes, maybe we, I don't know, it makes sense to not try to draw a line somewhere in them regarding which ones count as reason sensitive and not. It's just like maybe more or less. So. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I think so. Just to finish up on that, I would definitely, I think that is absolutely what I would want to say. I'm very much a kind of gradualist, very much spectrum kind of person. And I think one of the things that worries me about the way the debate is framed is it seems very binary, rational, non-rational, heuristic, easy, simple, reasoning, hard, difficult. What I really want to say is, we should think about what we're doing in a much more graded kind of fashion, and where the properties we're interested in float over which kind of process we're engaging in, I think. So that seems right to me,
Good.
Yeah.
Good. I think we should talk a little bit more about the insufficient reasons challenge and how you address that. Because it's all these different things that people might point to in favor of, well, look, there's just not enough of a role. The connection between our action, motivation, and reasons is not good enough, not strong enough to satisfy the predictions of common sense psychology. Like either, we act on very limited evidence, or it's like highly biased in certain ways, or we use these kind of non-logical or illogical kind of rules and heuristics. Just like other things that can, there's also some sometimes there's luck involved in our heuristics kind of getting things right. And whatever, you go on to describe a bunch of different things. How do you respond to the worry from the insufficient reasons argument or position that, look, these things just seem to get in the way or undermine the claim of common sense psychology that, yeah, we do act on reasons in that way?
Yeah, okay, good. I mean, I think what I want to say, so unlike the no reasons argument, where if it goes through, it's, absolutely showing us that common sense psychology is wrong, I think what the insufficient reasons argument pushes us on is a much more kind of nuanced picture, right? So it's saying, have a look at the evidence. Is the evidence strong enough to show us that we're not reaching the threshold required for rationality here? Because it's no longer trying to say that there's just all this stuff going on that doesn't look to reasons at all. It's saying you do look to reasons, but maybe it's just not good enough. You're just not looking properly at reasons. And that you can immediately see as a much more kind of nuanced argument, right? We're going to have to get into the woods of what the experiments really show us to decide whether, does this experiment show us it's bad? Does this experiment show us it's bad? So, it's going to be a much more kind of piecemeal response that I think you need to make if you're trying to defend common sense psychology from this insufficient reasons argument. But what I try and show in the book is that you've got these different strategies for approaching it, right? So you've got this weight of experimental evidence coming at you if you want to defend common sense psychology, all of which is supposed to cause a problem. And I think what you have to try and say is, well, hang on a minute. Let's look at that experimental evidence and let's ask ourselves what kind of problem it's supposed to be causing and, how robust it really is. So one thing I think you should do is really pay attention to the kind of methodological issues around some of this evidence. So, it's extremely well known that a lot of this social psychology literature faces a problem with replication. So, this was something that Kahneman himself really generously recognized, was that some of the really exciting kind of experiments just don't seem to replicate. So, one of the famous examples here is that there was this experimental finding that if you got participants into a room and you got them to do an experiment where they had to think about old people a lot, so you got them to, think about the places you'd find old people and the judgments that old people might make and all this kind of thing. If you then timed them when they were getting up from the experiment and leaving the experimental room, the suggestion was that they would move more slowly because you had primed all of their stereotypes about the old. One of the stereotypes about the old is that they move slowly. And because of the activation of these stereotypes, people themselves would actually move more slowly. And Kahneman talks about that experiment in very favorable terms in his 2011 Thinking Fast and Slow. But when people came to look at it and try and replicate it, try and do it again, it's actually been impossible to replicate, right? People just can't get the result that the original experimenters got. And I think what that shows us is that for some of the most kind of surprising and exciting experimental results here, we really need to make sure that they replicate, right? We really need to make sure that they are genuinely robust experimental findings. So we might get rid of some of the cases like that. We might also get rid of some of the experiments by noting other kinds of methodological worries. So I talk in the book quite a bit about what are called implicit association tests. So these are supposed to be tests that reveal implicit bias. And there's questions about whether those kinds of experiments show what's called test-retest stability. So these are supposed to be experiments which are tapping into a kind of standing state of an individual, right? Their judgments about people from protected or marginalized groups. And what you would expect would be that you would get a kind of consistency across the taking of that test. If someone has a particular kind of implicit bias, it shouldn't matter what day they take the test or what's been going on before the test. They should do the same. You should get the same kind of results when they take the test. But actually, it turns out that you don't really get that. If you go onto Project Implicit on the web and you take one of these implicit association tests, it's quite likely that you will get one result one day. And if you do the same test again 3 days later, you'll get a different result. And that seems like a problem, right? That seems like a methodological problem with these kinds of experiments. So I think there's a whole bunch of worries. There's something called ecological validity, where it turns out if you make tests more like the kinds of things people bump into in their day-to-day life, they get better at doing them. So there's a whole kind of set of methodological responses I want to make to these empirical experiments that help show us that the results aren't quite as damaging for common sense psychology as we might think. But that doesn't hold for all cases, right? So let me give you a case that looks, I think, like a really good case for irrationality here. So these are kind of framing cases in philosophy of language. So it turns out that if you describe a medical procedure to someone as having an 80% chance of survival, versus describing that same medical procedure to them as having a 20% chance of death, people are more likely to opt for having it in a hypothetical situation where it's described in the first way, 80% chance of survival, over the second way, 20% chance of death. But at least arguably, having an 80% chance of survival is the very same thing as having a 20% chance of death. So it looks as if you're getting people to change their decisions here, just not based on the facts of the matter, but just based on this kind of, totally irrelevant framing effect, just the way you're describing the situation. Now, that framing effects are very robust, right? Unlike some of the other experiments, you can get them to replicate really easily. You can show them in lots of different contexts. They have genuine behavioral effects. People are more likely to buy, in hypothetical situations, basketball players who are described as making 80% of their shots over basketball players who are described as missing 20% of their shots. So, this is a robust finding. It has an effect. Doesn't that show us that we're not reaching the standard of rationality here because we're allowing ourselves to be driven by these sort of irrelevant framing effects? So for these kinds of cases that are really good experiments that really do seem to show a problem here, I suggest that one of the things we need to do is get much more sensitive about the kind of evidence that people are looking to, right? Because framing effects don't come out of nowhere. They're not, there's a reason that people respond in the way that they do to a framing case. When something is described by a positively valence term, like, chances of survival, shots made, all these positive terms, what you're saying implicitly is that I, as a speaker, think this is a good thing. This is above the kind of standard threshold that you might expect for surviving your operation or for a number of shots made. When I use a negative framing, I'm telling you implicitly that this is a bad thing. I think that's a lot of shots to miss. I think that's a poor chance of survival. So the suggestion, and this is something that's been explored by quite a few philosophers now, is that actually once we're aware of the pragmatics of a conversation or a communicative exchange, we can see that there's much more evidence available to the decision maker than I think Kahneman and Tversky and other proponents of heuristics and biases were originally thinking of, right? So framing isn't irrational. What it's revealing is that we're actually incredibly good at tracking the messages that speakers are giving us, even when those messages aren't explicitly or literally conveyed. So the second line I want to take to insufficient reasons then is to say, well, they're perfectly sufficient once you're more careful about the kind of evidence we have to go on when we're making a decision.
So you brought up some of the stuff already, although we didn't really talk about that much about the intentional state attributions, and you mentioned the Churchlands and so on. But what do you make of the approach that says, okay, maybe these mental categories like beliefs and desires and so on, they to some degree track certain features of how our brains function and enable decent predictive behavioral modeling and so on. But it's a mistake maybe to take these much more seriously than that. And the common sense psychology is maybe more of a useful fiction or the useful partial fiction, maybe, even if it's tracking something real in us and so on. I don't know. It's kind of like a deflationary view. I mean, what do you think about this and just general skepticism about intentional attributions in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to ask. And it's definitely, I think there's a bit of a, I don't know if it's a resurgence, definitely a surge, I think, at the moment in views that want to be less realistic about propositional attitudes than I do, less realistic about states of mind. And I think I should say, I don't think anything in the book is a direct response to that kind of fictionalist approach. But I hope maybe that what I'm doing is trying to make the alternative look attractive. And I think the way that I try and make it look attractive is I sometimes think that maybe it's not always recognized what you're going to lose if you lose this common sense psychology framework as a genuine framework of not just action understanding, which is what you're suggesting. It's a fiction that we engage in when we're trying to understand the others, but it's not really an account of the kind of causal etiology of our actions. I think if you adopt that kind of view, you are going to lose a whole swathe of notions that we take to be really important in philosophy and which seem core to our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of our societies. So I can't really see how you're going to build back to notions like being an agent, maybe, but certainly, being responsible for an action, the idea that you can be praiseworthy or blameworthy for what you do. If it's not right that we're genuinely acting for reasons, I think we're going to lose, so much of our understanding of what it is to be a person, a person who is responsible for their actions and, can be held liable for the repercussions of what they do. All those kinds of notions to me seem to be founded on an idea that we're reasons responsive. And this is a point that Lynn Rudder-Baker makes actually really nicely. Sometimes the assumption seems to be that you could just drop out this common sense framework, common sense psychology framework, and everything else would just stay in place. All of our social organization would stay in place. All of our cultural notions would stay in place. But that, I think, is a big assumption, because it seems to me that our very understanding of society, our understanding of what it is to be an agent, of what it is to be able to interact with one another, already assumes this common sense framework, not just as a way to understand another, but as a genuine account of the causal roots of action. And actually, one of the things, so you're right, we haven't spoken about the third part of the book at all, really, which is about notions of action understanding. But regardless of that, I think one of the things that I did want to try and stress in the book is that, common sense psychology has much more commonly in recent years been thought of as a theory of how we understand other people. It's linked to mind reading. It's this idea that we have to mentalize others in order to know what they're doing or predict what they're going to do. And the causal picture has slightly dropped out of focus, I think. And so I did want to make the case that if you're a defender of common sense psychology, you need to be looking in both directions. You need to be defending that idea that we really do look to reasons when we're trying to understand others. But you also absolutely need to be defending that idea that your own actions in the first personal case are typically reason-driven as well. So it is that kind of two-handed picture that I wanted to defend.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. What you were saying there initially, if giving up on some of these aspects of common sense psychology actually does require giving up on other things that we might think are common sense or a sort of common way to view ourselves and society and the world, maybe that's more of a bullet to bite then. Although, I don't know, maybe people who reject the kind of folk psychology would be willing to bite those bullets. But that's a further conversation, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it is harder, so, this non-realist position is most commonly associated with Dennett, obviously. But the people I know who, are more expert in reading Dennett than I am say that actually he held a much more realist position than that, and he does want to sign up to this kind of causal model. I think it's quite hard to work out, exactly how you get to be, what this kind of mid-road is between being a full-blown realist like I am and an absolute fictionalist. Maybe there is some kind of middle position, but I think it's quite hard to find. So.
Yeah, I've found it the whole intentional stance stuff, is it getting at something actual, or is it more like a useful fiction? I'm not sure I've really understood. Maybe I'm just not super, up on all of Dennis' writing, but never been super clear to me, I guess, what actually his views about intentional state attributions are beyond, well, here's something we do in terms of taking an intentional stance and so on. But
yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add to that. I don't really know exactly, and whether there is an absolutely consistent line might be something we would ask. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. So then I'll just wrap it up in a couple minutes here. If you want and there's a lot more in this book that we haven't covered. I'll include links to where people can find that on. I think it's on Amazon now, or at the very least, you can get it through Oxford University Press. But yeah, if you just had any sort of closing remarks here about the book, about why people might want to check it out, and just
Great.
general remarks about common sense psychology. Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, so I hope people might want to check it out because, well, for one reason, because of the stuff we were just talking about, right? It seems to me that it is fundamental to our conception of ourselves as the kinds of things we think we are. And it's fundamental to the notions of responsibility and praise and blame and all these things that seem absolutely central to the organization of our societies. Fundamental to those notions that we are, broadly speaking, responsive to the reasons we have, that for the most part we do what we do for the reasons that we have. And I think it's not always noticed quite how much of a challenge to that view these kinds of experimental challenges coming from social psychology, behavioral economics, all these kinds of fields, exactly how much that challenges this kind of orthodox, common sense, philosophical stance. And it is a position that comes to us so naturally. It's so easy for us to assume a mentalizing stance, not just to one another, but to, animals, infants, computers. We just find this idea that we can explain and predict the behavior of others through appeal to mental states just incredibly natural. And so if we really did have to get rid of it, I think it would be difficult to maintain a lot of the things that we care about. And so taking seriously these challenges really matters, and trying to defend the position that I want to defend, I think really matters. And even if you don't want to do that, I think what I would hope for the book is that it maybe is a contribution to seeing what philosophers can bring to debates in psychology, because the heuristics and biases literature has been a massive debate across a number of academic fields. And it's also, unusual in that it's one of those fields that's got right out into the public consciousness. You see newspaper articles that will tell you how irrational you are these days. You will see, items on the news about failures of, proper thinking. And if you stop, the man or woman on the street, it's quite likely that she will tell you, she will know stuff, she'll have heard of the idea of implicit bias. She will have heard of the idea that, she's being nudged to do the things that she does rather than arriving at them through reasons and reasoning. And it seems surprising to me that this debate has gone quite so far and got quite so far out into the public realm. I think I might be wrong about this, but I think without much of a degree of kind of continued or focused philosophical attention about the key notions that it involves. And so that's really one of the things that I'm trying to do, trying to suggest that philosophers have a role to play in this debate. And, by getting involved, we might help to clarify exactly what's going on in these arguments.
Sure. Yeah, so I do like to end with one kind of general philosophical question, if you don't mind. What do you think is the value of philosophy? Like, why do you find philosophy worth doing? I mean, either for yourself or more generally for society. That's a big question.
Well, I think part of it, yeah. I think part of the answer is, the one I've just given you. It's surprising to me that so much of this understanding from heuristics and biases has gone so far and had such real world effects without, I think, a really sustained kind of philosophical attention to the core notions. So if you work in an academic department these days, it's quite likely that your university has sent you on some implicit bias training. It's quite, I also do some work in government, and, nudge has been hugely influential in government circles. The idea that we can nudge people to better decisions without kind of involving reasons and reasoning. And I think in both cases, it's surprising that it's had that degree of real world effect without there being any kind of consideration about, well, is this implicit bias training actually changing anything? There is no doubt that massive discrimination exists in the world, that there is huge injustice and that we need to address it. But the idea that the way we should address it is by trying to change people's cognitive associations has not been properly tested and hasn't been shown to be, the most effective way to address problems here. And so I think what philosophy at least one of the roles philosophy has to play is by asking people to think a bit harder before they invest, significant time and effort, whether they're really pursuing the right kind of lines of change here. So one way of thinking about philosophy is that it's incredibly abstract and it happens in the ivory tower and it doesn't have any real results at all. But I think I would want to pretty strongly push back on that, because lots of philosophy should have and does have genuine repercussions for real world issues.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely share that view. Yeah, so great. I guess I'll draw the question to a close there. Thanks so much for being here, Professor Borg, and taking my questions and writing this book and providing your very thoughtful responses. It's been great having you.
It's been really fun. I've really enjoyed chatting about it. So thanks for inviting me along. It's been great. Thanks very much.